everybody. I am here with one of my really good friends, Tajay Beulah. You are indeed in for a treat today. Tajay is a scholar of religious history in America. In fact, Tajay, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you for having me, Courtney. I teach history, ethics, and Black church and African diaspora studies at Methodist Theological School in Ohio. I specialize in our courses on US history, race. My two favorite courses to teach, I will say this, is a course on Howard Thurman and one on Martin Luther King. Those are my favorites. So
Why
yeah.
are those your favorites?
Well, one, because most people come to both classes with very little knowledge of both individuals. And so I kind of use the opportunity to teach them American history through the lives of these two theologians, and people absolutely love it.
So I find that really interesting because you are a scholar of religious history, surely in America or in the United States, but it sounded like there's a larger perspective being offered by chronicling these two theologians and activists.
Right. Because what happens is that I try to get people to understand the world in which these individuals grew up in. So you have to, let's take Thurman, for example. You have to think about, the development of the social gospel, for example, or this, approach to, this approach to Christianity that's rooted in service or rooting in very practical applications of the gospel. And so when he's coming of age, in the in the 20s and 30s, he's also this gospel, this is also having an influence on how he's developing his approach to the conditions and plights of Black peoples in the US. So I try to pull out these historic events, these events that are taking place in US history around the same time these people are also thinking and writing and showing how they're also having a bearing on their life and their work.
So tell me a little bit about what you do as a religious scholar and why religious scholarship or even Christian history as it is would be important for a lay person to know about.
Yes. What I do in my classes is that I try to make history accessible to them. I find one way that to do that is the inclusion of documentaries. I like to show people as much primary source footage as possible. I like to do what I call, for example, in the Martin Luther King class, I like to teach about the human king. And what I mean by that is that I think that American society, we make gods of our founding fathers, or we give them these huge titles. But I like to talk about King in his relationship with his dad, or his relationship with his wife. I like to talk about his hobbies. I like to talk about his failures, and not like I like to talk about his failures in a way to demonize him or make light of his life. But I think that, particularly because I teach seminarians, that these people are pastors and they need to be able to see themselves in someone who was also a pastor. So, and they need to be able to think about, like, with their flaws and with their hang-ups, et cetera, that they can do the same thing. They can also change, if not the world, they can at least change the small Methodist churches that many of my students pastor. To your second question, in terms of why is this important? Again, it's important for us to see ourselves in historical figures, to relate to their lives, to give us context on how we can address the same issues. But also with just Christian history, like taking the US context out of it, it's important to study Christian history because We need to understand how we got doctrines, or why we believe what we believe, what went into the creation of creeds, you know, and that's important for people to know. So I don't think people, fully understand the debates and the arguments that went into creating the church as we have it. So that's a good reason to look at a book like Justo Gonzalez's The Story of Christianity. It can be intimidating for a lay reader. It's a massive text, but it reads like a novel, like an epic novel. You know what I mean? So it's really accessible. You just have to commit to to realizing it might take you, a couple of months to get through it, but it gives a nice comprehensive view of Christianity.
What are some ways that this institution called the Black church helped to give birth to resistance, or helped to give birth to greater freedom from your perspective?
There's a lot there. I think the best way I could think to answer that question is to think about using the example of Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. I think what they did was model freedom. They modeled agency by creating their own institutions. The special thing about the Black church, and I will say, if any of your audience members have watched Henry Louis Gates's documentary that came out last week, I will say the one thing that he got right, because so many people are saying what he got wrong. What he got right about the Black church was that it's absolutely the institution, the first institution on U.S. soil that Black people actually had control over. And so I think that that's really the way I can attend to that question, is that these early Black church men and women gave us an institution to call our own and to shape it in the way that best suited our individual needs.
What were some of those needs?
Oh, I would say freedom of expression. I would say, Black churches were, particularly, the AME church, if we get into, that history there, I mean, these people were taking care of one another. They were providing resources. They were sharing resources. They were helping people to get an education, healthcare, and burial support. So these were like, they were being the community for the community. So I think that's really the genius of that institution. I mean, if we looked at Black Baptist churches and what a figure like Nannie Helen Burroughs was doing with the Baptist Convention and her work with women, I mean, she is preparing these people to become citizens. So it's not only about making sure that they have an education or that they're learning particular skills as trades, but also that, that they can go out in public and know how to operate and have the decorum to enter into certain spaces. I'm trying not to say politics of respectability, but I'm going with
what I've heard.
Yeah, but
hearing.
Yeah, but it's like, but people had to know, like, what public decorum to use in order to get jobs.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
To have access to economic advancement, like how to read, how to write, how to dress. Right. And so that's what Black church people did for Black communities. They helped them to navigate. That's exactly it.
Right.
That's exactly it. I'm thinking of one of my another historian that I really admire is Betty Collier Thomas. Again, massive book, but it's called Jesus, Jobs, and Justice, right? And I think that, again, if your audience, they're looking for material, that's another way to understand what Black church women were doing for Black communities. They were ensuring that these people were able to get jobs, to get justice, and also to have, some degree of defined leadership positions within their denominations as well. So that's another important part. So not just being able to do well in society, but also being able to do well in the institution that you are helping to build.
So good. So, I mean, when I think about the past, I think about how everybody went to church, right? And I don't even know if that's true, but that's sort of what we're raised to believe, that everybody went to church, everybody had a church, everybody was so Christian in the 60s and 30s and the 20s, right? And I think so much of that is about the institution that the Black church was, not only for one's spiritual livelihood, but for one's social livelihood, one's civic livelihood. Is there anything, as a historian, that you think the Black church had in the past, right? That the Black church has given up or lost sight of? And I ask this question because of the mass exodus of the church in the 80s, 90s, and now in the new millennium.
Oh, that's a big question. I think, and this is me, I had an interesting conversation with a reporter for a local newspaper here in Columbus, Ohio yesterday. And, we were talking about a recent article on from Pew Research on Black people. And I think that I think we're starting to see it again with like the rise of the Poor People's Campaign and William Barber and what we saw in Ferguson with Tracy Blackman. But I think we no longer have these like committed activist churches, right? And when I say that, I'm thinking of Birmingham, and not just 16th Street, Baptist Church, where there was a bombing. I'm thinking of like Fred Shuttlesworth. The name of his church in Birmingham escapes me right now, but there are no more activist churches where we know that we can go to this place and we can organize there, we can use their resources. I think that's it. And I think that we don't have those churches anymore because the 60s were a scary time, right? I mean, this is where we're seeing, and it's, there's still the same loss of life, right? But you have these church bombings, these, fires. We have, more active KKK activity. And I just think that we don't see these churches because people are afraid. I think about the SCLC post King's death and how most of those men got jobs. Like they didn't stay, right? They didn't stay close to the movement. They dispersed. And I think a lot of it just has to do with fear. And I think we're starting to understand the root of that fear, or even we can understand that fear a little better when we think about the events of the last month. What we saw at the Capitol on January 6th. Trump's movement, I believe him when he says, is just beginning. And I think that if we don't start to think about particularly Black Christians, and people who still hold on to Black churches for whatever reason, if we don't start to make those more inclusive places of women, of LGBTQ folk, then they're going to die off and continue to be ineffective. I think the Black churches can be more effective if they brought more people in and use their resources to fund and to fuel and to populate movements. I said a lot there, so if I need to clarify something, please ask me to.
No, you said a lot, but it was really, really good. So Tajay, most of the audience listening to us now is from the AME tradition. What would you say is the most compelling aspect of AME church history?
So recently I was doing some work with the Poor People's Campaign, and of course, like just about every institution right now, everyone is talking about pandemics because we are living in one. And I discovered in my work with them, they asked me to do some work on, you know, Black movements or civil rights history and pandemics. And so I was doing some work and I realized that essentially one way to tell the story of the founding of the AME is to tell it from the perspective of that church being born out of and in response to a pandemic. We have the narrative of, you know, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones being kicked out of St. George's, and but what we don't have is, you know, the Free African Society. I want to say Free African Society starts somewhere between 1789 and 1792. And again, it's this kind of mutual aid society where, and also not only is a mutual aid society, but when they got kicked out of St. George's, they were using the Free African Society as a way to gather, to have religious meetings. And it wasn't just these AME folk, it was also a great deal of Quakers involved in this movement as well. And so when the yellow fever epidemic of 1793 breaks out in Philadelphia, some of the Quakers, notably Dr. Benjamin Rush, approaches the Richard Allen and Absalom Jones and say, hey, we don't think that Black people can catch this pandemic. So we need this society's help with attending to this overwhelming amount of sick folk, right? Now, the Free African Society decide, well, we have the money, we have the resources, we can absolutely help. Well, what happens is Benjamin Rush and the other well-to-do white people, they roll out. So Richard Jones and the Free African Society, they're there attending to the poor and the sick, but also some of them are also getting sick as well. Well, there was a journalist by the name of Matthew Carey. I can't remember what newspaper or journal he worked for, but he starts to create the idea that the Free African Society are not only like they're taking care of these white people, but they're also robbing them. And so he writes this, you know, long letter, you know, disparaging Absalom Jones and Richard Allen. And what happens is Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, they respond with this full pamphlet documenting every single thing that the Free African Society did for the city of Philadelphia, and they publish it. It becomes one of the first publications of its kind, like rooted in protest. And so as a result of this fallout with the city and the Free African Society, the Free African Society has to disband, largely because they used all of their money to support the city of Philadelphia. Right? And so after they disband, they're figuring out, well, what are we going to do now? Well, out of that mutual aid society, the name of the church that that Absalom Jones founded, the name of it escapes me, but at first they wanted Richard Allen to become the pastor of that church. The reason why Richard Allen turned it down was because they were mostly going, it was more or less an Episcopal congregation, and Absalom Jones really wanted to stay rooted in Methodism. So Absalom Jones goes on to pastor this church, and then Richard Allen starts to organize what's now known as Mother Bethel, you know, AME church. And then, so the church was developed first, and then the establishment of the denomination came a little later after that. So essentially, the Free African Society and their response to the yellow fever pandemic of 1793 ultimately led to the denomination being formed in 1816.
Wow, I wonder what will spring forth out of this pandemic.
Hopefully new churches that are realizing that there are people who will sell you out. And we now have to reorganize ourselves.
Yes, reorganize ourselves and begin to share resources. I think that's one of the biggest things that I've taken from what you've said today, this
Yeah.
notion of the Black church being an institution where we can go to the storehouse and get what we as the community need.
Yeah. And can I say one more thing?
Sure.
Can I say one? I just think too that, you know, one of the things that I love about studying particularly early 20th century American history with respect to Black people, and even, you know, the tidbit that I just shared with this 19th century history with, you know, Richard Allen, is that, you know, early Black church leaders were really like our original creators. Like they were institution builders. And I think that we have lost that. And let me give you another example with Mary McLeod Bethune, a figure that we don't pay enough attention to her as a public intellectual, but also someone who had some really strong religious sentiments, right? And you know, and this woman, I think she, you know, may have went through like maybe the 8th grade, but was able to found an institution and then use that institution to have impact on politics in this amazing way. So I think that when we go back and look at these leaders, that, you know, of course there were already institutions in place, but they created institutions that met their particular needs as Black people. And I think that that's something worth holding on to, worth going back to, is thinking about who we are as institution builders.
That's so interesting. So the phrase that comes to mind is that we need to study the blueprint, right? These creators like established an institution that spoke to many needs across the board. And that's so interesting because we do, number one, forget to look back. And a lot of times we silence important stories because they don't show up in the right kinds of bodies, or, you know, it's not a man, or, you know, it's not someone who is heterosexual. And so it doesn't fit the criteria for respectability. And what's so fascinating about that is that this notion of respectability, right, which you and I were a little bit hesitant to even engage, right, because of the ways that it shows up in the current day discourse, right? Of, oh, you know, you're trying to make me either act white, or you're trying to say that what I am, or, you know, how I carry myself isn't good enough. But number one, these areas of respectability we recognize as sort of like these ways that the church teaches Black people to navigate society, while at the same time being very clear that there's something important within the Black community that actually can build institutions and communities, which leads us to survival.
Right.
The scarier part about it all is that this same inclusive institution, this same institution that uses respectability as a strategy, then like these things can go awry, right? Where the respectability then gets you in a chokehold, so that you're not able to honor and cherish and build off of stories that could potentially. I always think about what they did to Bayard Rustin.
Bayard Rustin, yeah. I actually, as you were talking, I was thinking of Bayard Rustin. I was thinking of Polly Murray. I was thinking of James Baldwin. James Baldwin, who is, you know, having this kind of intellectual renaissance, if you will, as more, you know, young people get a hold of his ideas. And I think that that's another beauty about some of the courses that I'm, you know, I listed my 2 favorite courses, but some of the courses that are kind of in creation. One, I'm thinking about, you know, gender, sex, and the civil rights movement, and looking at those 3 individuals and what they offer us, and how to, I think the word I want is probably not the best word, but the word I want is to unsilence them, right? To unsilence them and to really look at their ideas about organizing, about education, about race, and see what we learn from these voices that we've allowed to be silenced, that we allow them to be silenced because we know about them, but we don't, you know, produce. And this is not to say that there is not forthcoming work or that there isn't good work on these individuals, but it's good work for the academy. We absolutely need to make it good work for people like your audience, people, for it to be accessible to them.
Yeah. So this whole notion of accessibility, I'm concerned that my audience might not know who Pauli Murray is. So can you just give a little snapshot of Pauli Murray and why Pauli Murray's story is very important to the Black church, but also sometimes, I don't even want to use the word silenced, but neglected. How about neglected?
Yeah. I just looked over at my vision board. She's someone who's on my vision board. And so Pauli Murray, basically known as the first Black woman Episcopal priest, but she was so much more than that. She was a lawyer. She was a poet. She was absolutely brilliant and used her study in DC to come up with very creative ways to approach the issue of desegregation. She's also important to mention within the context of the conversation we were just having, was that Pauli Murray would today be someone who would be considered queer, right? And so she had these very interesting ways of expressing her, of performing gender. Right. And I only use she and her with respect to her because she did. But when some of her personal journals came out, you started to realize that this was someone who struggled to define themselves to themselves. But absolutely, there are at least maybe 3 to 4 texts, biographies of her life, but someone who definitely was, who definitely had great intellectual and theoretical ideas about how Black people could achieve freedom and equality in this country.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Tajay, I want to thank you so much for your time as well as your expertise. I'm telling you, you have so many books in your head. Every time I talk to you, you're like, oh yes, and this book and that book. It is such a pleasure to talk with you and to just share your brilliance with my audience. And until next time, we'll see you later.
Thank you.